So during this Advent season, we're celebrating, the arrival of Jesus, the arrival of the final phase of the God's plan of salvation. Jesus, Emmanuel, God is with us. But during this series, we're kind of stepping back to Genesis. Think of this as the pre-Advent. Because last week, Jason talked about how we have a need. He talked through the first couple chapters of Genesis and the introduction of sin and the separation of people from God. And it basically is going to be the problem that God is going to solve through his plan of redemption all the way through Scripture. But in the middle of it, there's this little glimmer of hope. There's the phrase that there is going to be one to come. Although his heel is bruised, he will crush the head of the serpent. There is one who will come to provide salvation. And in a nutshell, Genesis, we're going to start seeing the groundwork, the introduction of this plan of salvation. Today, we are in the book of Genesis, the 15th chapter. If you want to go there and get ready, it's the life of Abraham. And in Abraham's life, we start to see those little seeds of what the plan is going to be like. So if you want to follow along, Genesis chapter 15, first 6 verses. The passage actually starts up with this, after this, ... So I thought we'd pause. Let's go find out what Abraham's been up to this point, because it's going to kind of give us some context for what the passage is going to say. Abraham, or at this point, Abram, or if you want to get really Hebrew, Avram. I'm just going to say, I'm going to call him Abraham. If I try to change the name, I will be going back and forth and it'll be confusing. He was from the people of the Chaldeans. It's a people, would be now southern Iran. It's a people we're familiar with throughout the Old Testament because they're going to become the nation of Babylon. They will become an instrument God will use to punish the nation of Israel eventually. So it's a bit ironic that at the start of God's salvation story, he's going to reach down into that people and pick one person. And throughout Abraham's story, we're going to get the first visible signs of God's promises. So God reaches down and meets with Abraham. And he gives Abraham this promise. He says, I'm going to give you a land of your own, and you're going to be the start of a great nation. And to top it off, through you, all families of the world will be blessed. Now, if you're familiar with the account of Abraham, you know that there's a sticking point at this point, because a man who is promised to bring blessing to all families is a person who is without family. He has not been blessed with a family himself, and his wife and he are actually at the point, they're probably moving beyond the childbearing age. So this astounding promise looks a bit unbelievable to a 75-year-old with no children. Yet Abraham chooses to go where God leads him, as God has commanded. He packs up his family, his belongings, grabs his nephew Lot, because Lot's father had passed away, and Abraham was the eldest son. So he kind of has to take responsibility for Lot. He brings him, and he travels to the promised land. And many years later, after Abraham and nephew Lot have settled, God is blessing them. Their crops are growing, their herds are growing, their people are growing, their wealth is growing, such that he and Abram have to split. The land can't support both of them. And so Lot chooses which way he goes. He's going west. So Abraham goes east. And as he turns and as he's traveling to his new land, he gets another visit from God. God shows up and says, raise your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, westward. For all the land you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if you can count the dust of the earth, your offspring can also be counted. And it's a fantastic metaphor for, Abraham is part of a nomadic people, very familiar with dust, ever present in all they do. If it wasn't a snowy wonderland outside today, we could kind of pause here. We can go out. We can kick our feet through the grass and through or wherever's left of the grass, through the dirt, and we could see it. Counting dust is nigh impossible. It's packed. It's hard to count. It's small. So the point is, Abraham's blessing is going to be innumerable. And dust for Abraham now becomes this visible reminder. God has promised something. Every time he brushes the dust off his sandals, he's remembering God has promised something. He's not seeing it, but it's been promised. I wonder when I read this, what does the word offspring what emotion does it evoke? It has this promise of great offspring, but at the same time, he doesn't see the signs of it yet. This is several years after the first promise. And he and Sarah are not getting any younger. So we jump ahead several units of time because the book of Genesis is a little vague, how much time goes on. And Lot and his family, living off in Lot's land, get caught up in this local turf war. 5 kings get together. They go raiding, capturing, pillaging. And so Lot, his family, his herds get pulled off, and the raiding kings head north. Abraham hears of it, gathers a couple of the families around him, and he goes after them. This is a story I wanted in children's Bible. I wanted to read this one. Commando Abraham with his people hauling north to catch up with the king and their 5 kings and their armies. I'm a child of the 80s, so I'm picturing Schwarzenegger and Stallone and maybe like the Lord of the Rings, where you see the 3 going after the hobbits. There's this daring nighttime raid. They split their forces. They attack by surprise. They recover everything that has been stolen. And then they head back. And on the trip home, Abraham runs into this strange priest king named Melchizedek. And we could linger here for a while because Melchizedek becomes this image and role of what Jesus will kind of look like as a priest and a king. But it's not really what we're going to cover. If you want to get more, the book of Hebrews kind of goes into this in depth. We talked about it a while back in our adult Sunday school. But, we've tarried long enough in the backstory. So let's get to the passage at hand. So after Abraham leaves Melchizedek, returns home, he gets a third visit from God. After these events, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward is very great. The Lord greets Abraham with the do not be afraid. Normally in the Old Testament, and in New Testament as well, when you're visited by a divine being, do not be afraid is probably the first words you're going to hear. When the divine, the spiritual meet us humans, there is a lot of shock and awe. But this is Abraham's third conversation with God, so it may not be just this that Abraham is afraid of. In the Old Testament, a lot of these conversations from God starts out with, do not be afraid, and God will then explain, this is why you don't have to be afraid. I acknowledge you're afraid. Now let me explain how I'm going to solve it. I think to Moses, King Og of Bashan is bearing down on Moses and his people. And God visits Moses and says, do not fear. I got this handled. I'm going to hand them over to you. Joshua gets to visits like this in his book, where he's standing and sees an army. God visits and says, don't be afraid. I will give you this land. I will give you this army. My favorite, and it has a little touch of the Advent story, is when the Lord visits Isaiah the prophet and says, I need you to go tell King Ahaz to calm down and not be afraid. In spite of 2 armies that showed up at the gates of Jerusalem. They're planning on conquering Jerusalem and placing their own king over the city, but it's not going to happen. And it's in that whole conversation that you get these echoes of Christ that we'll talk about. But for Abraham, I think we're going to learn from his response. His enemy is this growing doubt. He's getting older. He has not received what was promised. Time is marching on. He and Sarah are moving further beyond the childbearing years. Doubt creeps in. Before we move on, let's recognize, though, God's grace in the do not be afraids. God could have been justified to call out the lack of faith in all these people. Moses, I told you I am with you. Why are you afraid? Joshua, I promised to give you this land. Why are you afraid in this moment? King Ahaz, you have the Torah. The law says you obey, I will bless you and protect you. So why are you sitting afraid? Abraham, you had 2 promises already. But their fear is met by God with this gracious tenderness, this recognition, this is where you're at. I just want you to know, do not be afraid, I have this handled. It's not beyond my gaze. I know what you're going through. I have the power to handle it, and you can trust me to do it. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, and your reward will be very great. And the shield is a poetic image of divine protection. David liked to use it in his Psalms. At one point, he's being chased by his son, who's intending to kill him and take the throne. And David writes, but you, O Lord, are a shield about me. Just a beautiful image of care. And for the first time in his meetings with God, Abraham responds to God. He says, Lord God, what can you give me? Since I'm childless and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. Abram continued, look, you have given me no offspring, so this slave born in my house, he's going to inherit it. And in the Hebrew language, Abraham's words are even more raw. When he says, I am helpless, it is literally, I am naked. I am without what I need. I'm vulnerable. To someone in that culture, the lack of a family meant the lack of protection. Your family is part of your identity. Your family is part of your status. And also the belief that if you didn't have any kids, children, you must be cursed. This must be God's punishment on you. Think of the book of Job, where Job loses everything, and his friends come, and what their common refrain is, well, these bad things were happening to you. It must be because you have sinned. So when God promised him a great reward, Abraham's response is almost a bit dismissive. He says, your reward isn't going to be worth anything because it's going to end up in someone else's hands. In the Near Eastern culture, a childless couple could name one of their slaves to be the inheritor. And the fact that Abraham already has a name in mind means he's already going through options. Maybe he's hedging his bets. And again, God responds with this incredible tenderness to Abraham. This one will not be your heir. Instead, one who comes from your own body will be your heir. Then he took him outside and says, look at the sky and count the stars. If you're able to count them, then he said to him, your offspring will be that numerous. So the Lord repeats the promise for the 3rd time. And he's being very specific. The heir is coming from you, Abraham. I love the metaphor of, we did the counting of the earth, but now the stars in the sky. We live in the suburbs, and so when I walk out at night, I get this wimpy living in the suburbs night sky. You can see stars, maybe a plane going overhead, but I'm not getting the full experience. A few years ago, our family traveled to Maine. We had talked with our kids. We said, okay, what do you want to see? Mountains and ocean. Okay, so we'll head east. We stayed on this house on the coast. And the first night we stayed there, no clouds. So to the east of us, ocean, no light pollution there. The nearest small town to the west of us was probably 10, 15 miles away. And you walked outside that first night, and it was awe-inspiring. If you've ever been to a place where there is no light pollution, you see what you can actually see, what's actually up there. You feel a little ripped off to live in the suburbs. It's like watching one of my old 8mm home videos my mom took of Christmases, and then immediately throwing on some ultra high def 4K movie. That's the night sky that Abraham sees. So when he says, count the stars, it's not like, okay, the 1, 2, 3 that we get. It is just a blanket of light and nebulae and all these other things. And this has a dual meaning, in a sense. When God tells him that his new physical son that's to come, his heir, is going to come from his own body, but it's going to be this numerous, there's a sense that Abraham is the father of the nation of Israel, which is then going to grow and grow and live. But there's this spiritual sense of it, that because one of the kids, one of his, down his lineage that will come from that line will be Jesus. And spiritually, through Jesus, we will all be like it says in the book of Romans. Abraham will be our father in a spiritual sense. And so Abraham's response, it says, Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Old Testament scholar Joyce Baldwin said this. I like this. Abraham had received a specific promise from God, but he did not seem to receive what was promised. And he could do nothing to achieve it. He was helpless, so much so that the promise almost appeared to mock him. Yet, Abraham's response was to look to the greatness of the one who had spoken, and to accept the Lord took responsibility for the fulfillment of his promise. Faith rests on the fact that God is faithful. And when we take God at his word, we prove for ourselves his faithfulness. And in this verse, there's a strange thing, because when he says Abraham trusts, he believes in God, the verse states that when he believes, he gets credited righteousness for that belief, or right standing with God, instead of living in his separate state due to his sin. And from a narrative perspective, this verse is a bit weird. I mean, we've not been talking about righteousness the whole time. We've been talking about the promise of God and Abraham's issue. So why is it here? Genesis does not shy away from the sin of Abraham. He does awful things. He is not perfect. He does have need. But in the statement, we know that his problem isn't necessarily the heir, which is what he is forefront in his mind. His problem is the same problem that we talked about last week. It is singular because we are now separated from God due to sin. It's like the account of Jesus when they lowered the paralytic in, and everyone's standing around waiting for the huge, he's going to heal him, it's going to be great. And what's the first words that Jesus says? He says, your sins are forgiven. And it's not what people would expect, but Jesus knows what the ultimate need of that paralytic was. It wasn't necessarily healing, but it was forgiveness. In the same way, this text makes that same claim. We've been talking about the promise in the heir that is need, but Abraham's core need is the problem of his separation from God, from what his sin has caused. And in this statement, introduce one of the main truths of the gospel, that faith will be central to the gospel message. The Apostle Paul will look back at this verse and show it's not genealogies, it's not your exemplary rule following that's going to earn you favor with God. It's not going to earn you righteousness. It's going to be faith. It's going to only be through faith in God. When the Galatian church, church that Paul had founded, starts to question whether faith in Jesus is all that is needed. Visitors come and they start talking about, well, faith is good, but we have these other things that we've always been doing that we should be doing. You should probably adopt them because you're going to need the whole package. So when Paul responds in his letter to Galatians, he says, so then does God give you the Spirit and work miracles among you by your doing these works of the law, by this obedience? Or is it by believing what you've heard, that just like Abraham, who believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness, so know that those who have faith, these are Abraham's sons. Faith plays a central role in the gospel message as described by the writer of Hebrews. The writer of Hebrews says, now without faith it is impossible to please God, since the one who draws near to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. I mean, it's a wonderfully pragmatic verse. Don't expect to please a God that you don't believe in, nor expect that God you don't believe in will reward you. But if we're going to go a little deeper, we look at one of the great explanations and examples of faith. It's in the letter of the Hebrews, 11th chapter. At the end of the 10th chapter, the writer is encouraging a church that is under persecution to remain faithful, to believe that rescue is coming. And then he decides, well, I should probably define faith. I should explain it. And so it starts out in Hebrews verse 1. Now, faith is the reality of what is hoped for and the proof for what is not seen. For by this our ancestors were approved. And it's a weird, almost like riddle-like verse definition, because it's mixing tangible and intangible together. How can something that I hope for, I'm not seeing it, be the same thing as reality? How can I have proof in something that I can't see nor detect? So faith has this essence of mystery to it, but the rest of the Hebrews is an account of the many people in the Old Testament who have showed faith in God. And the key is that the faith is in one who is faithful. Sarah even makes an appearance, Abraham's wife. Hebrews says, by faith, Sarah herself, when she was unable to have children, received power to conceive offspring, even though she was past the age, since she considered that the one who had promised was faithful. Therefore, from one man, in fact, from one as good as dead, came offspring, as numerous as the stars of the sky and as innumerable as the grains of sand along the seashore. And this is the one aspect of faith. Faith is not based on the one that's having the faith. I think we can often mistake faith as something that we generate. If we believe hard enough, this thing will come into reality. If that were true, I would have faithed the Minnesota Vikings into a Super Bowl long ago. And this will be their 64th year in a row without a championship. This is kind of that Disney version of faith. When you wish upon a star, it makes no difference who you are, for if you wish upon a star, your dreams will come true. Gospel faith is based solely on the one who made the promise. Abraham believed he would finally receive an heir, not because he really, really, really wanted an heir, and he did really, really want an heir, but because it was promised by someone that Abraham came to trust, had the ability to deliver on that promise and a willingness to deliver. New Testament scholar Amy Peeler said, what God has revealed of the divine character is that which gives confidence that God will bring the remaining promises to fruition in the future. Faith is to see that what God has already tangibly revealed to be true and trust that God will continue to act in line with his revelation of that truth. But faith has this different aspect as well. Paul writes to the Ephesian church, "For you are saved by grace through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is God's gift, not from works, so that one can boast." There is a tension in our faith between our belief and decision to trust, and that faith, saving faith, is this gift wrapped up in grace and given to us freely. We have faith because we can trust in God, and even to have that faith is this gift that is given to us. So why is faith important to those of us who are followers of Jesus? Numerous reasons, and it would take way past the potluck to go through them all. But I'm just going to focus on one that I hope that can encourage us. Faith, by definition, includes an aspect of waiting. Many of the promises of God are not fulfilled quickly. God does not offer the Amazon 2-day shipping guarantee on promises. From the moment when God promised Abraham an heir, he waited nearly 25 years to see that heir until Isaac arrived. And related to that is another hard truth, that the waiting could be the most important part of the experience. It can be this crucible that solidifies our faith and our character is formed, and we learn that we can trust God even more fully. Now, chapter 11 of Hebrews contains all these stories of people who did amazing things and trusted that God would provide. Some of them got fulfilled in their lifetimes. And it says others died not seeing the promise fulfilled. They all died in faith, although they had not received the things that were promised. But they saw them from a distance, greeted them, and confessed that they were foreigners and temporary residents here on earth. But they now desire a better place, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. The resurrection of Jesus it changed the nature of waiting in faith for Christians. There is no longer an expiration date for when we need to see God's promises fulfilled. When Jesus, through his death, his resurrection, provided not only forgiveness of sins, but he conquered death. We no longer have to fear we only have so much time before we need to see these things come true. Our faith is ultimately anchored to a God who, through Christ's sacrifice and resurrection, has conquered death and sin. We can trust that he will provide whatever we need by his power and his wisdom at the right time. If you're one who does not believe yet, this all seems strange, vaguely like wishful thinking. Talk to myself, talk to the pastor, any of the elders. Our faith in God has solid roots in the faithfulness that God has shown and in the revelation of who Jesus was. We'd love to talk to you about that.